Hey, howdy, hey, y'all. Coffee Lux here, and welcome to a studio vlog. Now, this past week, I have been working on getting my resin casts sanded and dye painted, and these are the final steps for getting the resin finished to assemble onto the final dolls. And I thought I would give you a peek into how I do that. Now, one of my favorite tools in my tool arsenal for crafting is my beloved Dremel. This thing has been with me for many years and I use it all the time. It is one of my favorite tools. And it comes really in handy with finishing up the resin bits for my dolls. Coming from a cosplay background, I used my Dremel quite heavily when tooling foam and making armor and things like that, and it's just such a great tool to have, and it's so multi-purpose. I always find a reason to get my Dremel out. So the first thing that I'm doing here with these casts is cutting off all of the extra resin that spilled over in the molds. I typically will overfill my molds just because I prefer to mix enough resin just in case I spill or something happens, because trying to color match after the fact can be difficult with scaling down the amount of resin used to make the initial casts. I typically use 20 grams of each component for my resin, so a total of 40 grams of resin is used to make 2 sets of doll heads and hands, and that's typically what I do whenever I'm crafting. It's a lot more productive to make multiple molds and do multiple casts at the same time, because the cure time for these is 24 hours, and to wait 24 hours on one set of head and hands is it's not really great overall when you're trying to make a deadline. It just makes things really slow. So anyway, trying to scale down the 40 grams of resin with my dye recipes. I have a specific number of drops of each color that I use to mix to make these skin tones. So I have like a recipe book essentially of everything for every skin tone that I offer. That way I can make them consistent. So yeah, I peel off all of the excess bits from all of the pieces, and then they will be ready for dremeling. The first thing that I do with the hands is Dremel all the way through in between the palm and the fingers so that my brooms can fit through and the hands hold on to the broom. When I first made these hands, I made them with a hole in the middle and did not think about the fact that when I made a silicone mold using these, the silicone would go through that hole and then make it difficult for me to pull the hand out. I just didn't think of the physics of, the volume of space and how that would get filled with the silicone. So basically what I decided to do was fill the hole in my original cast and cast it that way, and then Dremel out the hole later. And this does work for me. It's definitely more work and it's kind of messy, but unless I want to make a 2-part mold and make things a little more complicated, I just decided not to do that. So yeah, we just get a little bit of mess. Now in the future, when I'm able to acquire a bigger and better studio setup, one thing that I will definitely make sure to have is a sanding booth. And I think that having a sanding booth is going to serve me a lot better. As you can see, I'm pretty much a floor goblin when I work on sanding these resin casts, because I don't have a better space to do it. This is where I have the best light. I can't sand at my desk because, as you can see, the mess is so much that it just gets all over everything, and trying to clean that up is such a headache. And here I'm just smoothing out any rough edges, making sure that everything is soft and ready so that when I put, the fabric scarves over the head, there's nothing pointy and it's nice and flush. And I do the same with the hands. And in the hands also, I Dremel out the space for the armature to go into the hand, and I use a strong glue to hold those pieces together. Now, this next part is it's an interesting solution that I had to come up with in order to paint the eyes on these dolls. Because I carved the initial masters with a recess in the eye area, which I like. I think that it was a nice design choice, and I think that it looks really good. However, I didn't realize how difficult it would be to paint the inside of the eyes, being such small spaces. And I tried several times to find small enough paintbrushes to be able to paint inside the eye area, and nothing was working. And my partner suggested a tiny syringe as a solution, and it ended up being absolutely genius, and it works really, really well. This ended up being a lot of trial and error when I first started doing the eyes this way. It was really difficult for me to be steady enough in my hand to get the needle in the eye without getting the paint all over the outside of the eye. And I do have to keep wet paper towels on hand to clean up any spots that end up on the resin outside of the eye space, which happens quite frequently. But honestly, the results are worth the stress of trying to make such a small space work. So I feel a little bit like a mad scientist when I do this part. It's really fun. It is very tedious, and I mess up quite a lot, but the end result is always worth it. And for the syringe filling, the paint that I use is just an acrylic black paint that I watered down. The trick is to make sure that it maintains the amount of opacity it needs to actually be, a dark black eye, but also be thin enough that it can go through that fine needle. And it really works pretty well. I am always happy with this result. After my eye painting has finished drying, I move on to the shading portion for the skin tones. And what I like to do for the shading is use the same resin dye that I use to make the skin tones. Typically, I will pick the darkest color in the mixture of colors to make up the skin tone to use as the shading. I ended up landing on this method after failing trying others, which isn't that just how it goes all the time. You try and try, you fail, and then you eventually find something that works. I had initially tried using an acrylic wash to dye the resin or paint the resin with, and I didn't really do my research, but honestly, it was a complete tragedy. And they did not look good at all. The shading was horrendous and patchy, and acrylic just does not adhere well and behave well on resin. So I had to get creative. One day when I was fiddle farting around trying to figure out what to do, I decided to give the dye a shot and see how it would behave being put on resin after the resin has cured. And I was pleasantly surprised with the way that the dye behaved on the cured resin, and it became my go-to method for shading. It works really, really well. It soaks into the resin and does not come off. So it's a really good permanent solution that doesn't even require any extra sealing. I think that painting the skin and making it look mottled and old and more earthy is one of my favorite parts of making these dolls. It's a very, very satisfying process. And yeah, I really enjoy it. Depending on the darkness of the skin tone itself, I might shade once, twice, sometimes even 3 times to get the shading to be a dark contrast to the rest of the skin. So sometimes it is required to do a little more work. With these lighter skin tones, it's a lot easier because it's just kind of one and done. I can do the shading in all of my contrasted spaces one time and move on to the freckling. I find this process to be really therapeutic too. So I'm going to stop the voiceover and let you just watch and listen to music and enjoy the process. I also do the same type of shading on the hands just to kind of enhance the boniness and the dips and make sure that there's a high contrast in the hands. They look a lot better this way, a lot less flat. I really like to take already 3D art pieces and make them pop even more. So the contrast of adding the dye to the hands and enhancing the boniness and the withered look that I want them to have, I find it to be really, really pleasing. Now, this next section of work is arguably more fun than even the shading. This is my favorite thing to do, and it is apply freckles to the skin using a skewer or a toothpick. And I randomly did this one day when I was trying to figure out how to more effectively age and model the skin. And I had a bunch of these skewers laying around the kitchen, and I thought, hey, that's a sharp little point. That could make some nice little freckles. And I tried it, and it worked so well. I will usually do a couple passes of freckles, and you'll see me dabbing off resin dye at different points when I'm doing this, and I did it on the shading as well. And that's just to absorb some of the dye so that the painted areas and the freckle bits don't get too dark at any given spot. I don't want any of the dye pooling and becoming too much of a contrast. So I'll periodically dab some of that off with a tissue or a paper towel and continue that way. But I will usually do a couple layers of freckles just to make them look as natural as possible. And it's really fun, so I don't mind going over these with a couple passes. And I also use the same method on the hands. I like to add freckles and some dark skin patches just to make things look a little bit more natural. Next up, I'm going to be doing the exact same processes on my green gals. There's really nothing different happening with this model. It's all the same processes as the previous, so I am going to end this current voiceover and let you enjoy the art montage. as a final step, I do like to add blush to all of the cheeks of these dolls. I think that it adds a nice warmth to them and looks really, really sweet. And I use the same pink on all of the skin tones, except for maybe some of the darker ones. I might go a little bit darker with the blush, but for the most part, I really, really love this shade of pink, and it works out really well on all of these dolls. Depending on the depth of the skin tone, I might do one or more passes of the pink just to make the blush as blushy as I can. And so with these light ones, it doesn't take much, just one coat. I really love doing the blush on these dolls in this way, and I remember when I first started trying this out, I used acrylic paint like I did with the shading, and it was so horrid. These hags look like they had little clown cheeks. It was the worst thing I think I have done. It was so tragic. So for the resin dye to be perfect for this, I cannot be more thankful. Another option that I was going to try at some point was going to be using pan pastels or chalk, like that are used to color polymer clay pieces and things like that. But honestly, this works just as well, and I don't need to bother with sealing it because it soaks into the resin. So why fix something that isn't broken, you know? Well, we have successfully concluded the week of crafting, and I got done pretty much everything that I had set out to do, albeit a day late. I keep mismanaging my time a bit because I forget that filming your process actually takes time away from the act of crafting itself. So everything that I wanted to get done yesterday, I had to finish up today. But, you know, it's all good. That's life. As our fellow friend Greg would say, ain't that just the way? But I'm really happy with how these turned out. I got all of my dremeling done and painting done, so they are now ready for final assembly. So once I finish getting the clothing made, I can get these dolls assembled and they will be ready to go for my art markets. And the dolls that I finished the dye paint on this past week are 2 models of the hopefully 5 models that I will be offering at the art markets in a month. So I still have a lot of work to do to get out the rest of these models, but I think that I can make it happen, so I'm not gonna sweat it too much. So thanks for joining me on this week of studio vlog crafting, and I will hopefully see you soon. Thanks for sticking around, pals. Toodaloo.